being the demon that the guy who kills demons in his underwear usually kills. Yeah, I think that's right. Welcome to Same Name, Different Game. I'm Joe, and you know what time it is. It's October, there's a chill in the air, and it's time to talk about spooky video games. Now, I've been talking about Capcom a lot this year, so I figured, why stop now? And this episode we'll be talking about a game that not only has ghouls, ghosts, and goblins, but one that lets you play as one of those creepy creatures of the night. But not just any one of those. One of the most feared enemies in classic gaming, so let's get started with a little history. This is pretty well trodden ground around here at this point, but in 1985 Capcom released the first entry in one of their classic franchises, Ghosts and Goblins, known in Japan as Makaimura. The game is well known for its great music, spooky vibes, and incredibly punishing difficulty. And a big part of that? This guy right here, your friend and mine, the Red Armor. He flies around, swooping down at our hero Arthur, and just generally being a pain in the neck. 3 years later, a sequel, Ghouls and Ghosts, appeared in arcades with more weapons, more levels, more enemies, and a host of new mechanics. But the more things change, the more they stay the same, and the Red Armor was back, frustrating as ever. Shortly after the release of Ghouls, Capcom all-star producer Tokuro Fujiwara, the man behind the G&G series, tapped his protege, Masahiko Kurakawa, to direct a spin-off of the series, starring its most famous enemy. That game became known in Japan as Red Armor Makaimura Gaiden, and in English-speaking territories, as Gargoyle's Quest. The title screen actually says Gargoyle's Quest, Ghosts and Goblins, but neither the box, nor cartridge, nor label carry that title. In fact, the Red Armor, named Firebrand outside of Japan, isn't even red on the box, so I'd wager that most folks didn't even realize this was related to Arthur's adventures. That didn't affect the positive reception though, with GamePro saying it is by far one of the most exciting releases yet created for the Game Boy. This really was one of the most impressive games on the platform in 1990, only a year after the system's launch, and it was only a matter of time until a sequel was put into production. Now, it merits mentioning that the first game starring Firebrand was put on the Game Boy for a reason. In a 1994 interview with Japanese magazine Famicom Tsushin, Fujiwara said the following.
Initially, we wanted to make sure we didn't overshadow Makaimura, so we decided the Game Boy would be best for a first outing. Then, once that game was well received, we wanted to try doing a full colour attempt, which became Red Armor 2 for the Famicom.
And that's our first game for this episode. Released in Japan simply as Red Armor 2, and in English-speaking territories as Gargoyle's Quest 2, this one hit the US and Japan in 1992, and Europe in 93. Once again, the game has a subtitle not mentioned on the box or anywhere else. It's The Demon Darkness. This game is in fact a prequel to the Game Boy entry, telling the story of how Firebrand initially became the legendary Red Blaze. Like the original, it features classic Capcom side-scrolling action with a bit of an RPG-style overworld thrown in. But while the first game in the series had random battles, this entry does away with them, using the map as a means to get to different areas and occasionally find bonus items. The only problem with this approach is that there's almost no backtracking and only one really significant thing to find off the beaten path, which makes the map feel unnecessary. A little more than halfway through, you find a scientist who tells you he can create an item that will help you if you can get him 2 components. Finding these components is not at all obligatory to finishing the game, and if you don't talk to this guy, you'd never even know. But that really is the only thing I can think of that can be missed, and I question if the game wouldn't flow a bit more smoothly without the map sections. Still, the game world is small, and without random battles, it's not as if it creates a ton of padding. But what does create a ton of padding, at least in one portion of the game, is the continue mechanic. Certain townsfolk will give you a password. Talking to these ghouls creates a continue point, so if you lose all your life, you go back to the last goblin that gave you one. Now, I'm not the first one to mention this, but it creates a huge problem shortly into the game, where you're required to take on several stages without meeting another password giver. This can lead to retracing the same steps over and over again. And to boot, part of this section includes one of the most frustrating jumps in the history of video games. Just look at this. But honestly, I'm starting to feel like I'm piling on a little bit. But consider everything I just said to be a primer on the game's few flaws. This game really is awesome, and one of my favorite unsung Capcom titles. As Firebrand, you're much more mobile than the gallant knight Arthur was in the main G&G series. Firebrand can fly, at first for a very limited time, but as you progress, your wings get stronger. He can also only shoot one weak projectile at a time, though as you gain more strength, you get more options for firepower, including tornadoes that act as platforms and gunk that sticks to spikes, rendering them harmless. Speaking of that, Firebrand can cling to walls, much like Ryu Hayabusa of Ninja Gaiden fame, and this makes a lot of the stages in this game explorable in all directions. While some stages in the main Ghosts and Goblins games are vertically oriented, the lack of traversal options for Arthur means you're held to ladders and jumping, but with Firebrand's abilities, stages are able to move along both the X and Y axis seamlessly. Sadly, the bosses don't match up to the stages. While most of them are very cool looking, few represent a threat, including the final 2 bosses who are basically pushovers. Though admittedly, that's preferable to going the other way and having overly difficult boss encounters. Speaking of cool looking, this is one of the best looking games on the platform. Coming in the system's later days, Capcom's folks had really figured out what made the NES tick by this point, and Gargoyle's Quest 2 really shines. Many of the figures you meet resemble monsters from the main Makaimura series, and the various bosses and smaller monsters are really interesting. The stages themselves have a creepy lived-in, or perhaps died-in, feel to them, with lush backgrounds and fitting environmental hazards. The music, of course, is excellent too, as one would expect from this era of Capcom. Yuki Iwai is credited with the soundtrack, and while this was her first project at Capcom, she would go on to compose for games in the Street Fighter, Mega Man, and Marvel franchises. For her first outing, she really killed it, with a slightly darker tone than most of the music found in the main G&G series. The songs still manage not to become dirge-like and drag down the feel of the action in the game. I love it. So by now you might be wondering, what's the second game for this episode? I mean, we all know how this goes, right? Capcom released 3 games in the series, one on each of Nintendo's first 3 cartridge-based systems: Gargoyle's Quest for the Game Boy, Gargoyle's Quest 2 for the NES, and Demon's Crest for the Super NES. Right? Wrong. Allow me to introduce you to Makaimura Gaiden: The Demon Darkness on the Game Boy. Ported by Sun L and released only in Japan in 1993, the second installment of the Firebrand trilogy did in fact find its way to Nintendo's handheld behemoth. And, well, it's really similar to the NES game. To a fault, I would say. The sprawling stages of the NES game are faithfully replicated here on a system whose screen resolution is considerably smaller than that of the NES, meaning there are blind jumps and what for all intents and purposes are hidden spikes all over the place. It's certainly an impressive port, maintaining all the stages and bosses of the original while adding 2 new optional stages, no new bosses though. Still, one can't help but feel the game would have been better served by redrawing the stages completely to keep the proportions better, because I'm not kidding when I say there are a lot of leaps of faith in this game. I've seen people tout these extra stages as making the game a more definitive experience, but they're really missable. Both as a practical matter, you can literally miss them, and in that they're not particularly interesting. They're not bad, but they're far from amazing, and they certainly don't add much to the overall experience. They're also the most noteworthy differences. Well, besides the game being in black and white. To be fair, those 2 optional stages add 2 new powers for Firebrand, a homing fireball and an astral projection that allows him to scout areas a little bit, but I didn't find either to be that useful, practically speaking. The astral projection comes pretty late in the game, and it's a bit cumbersome to use. The homing fireball sometimes doesn't do its job very well, and only one can be on screen at a time, making it a bit of a liability. There are some minor changes to a couple stage layouts, but the most noticeable of the smaller changes are with bosses. The doppelganger you face in the House of Mirrors becomes much slower with his attack, making him even more of a pushover than he was in the NES game, since his only really effective attack is swooping at you super fast. The final boss actually becomes a bit harder in this version. In the NES original, his lower fireball will float up high enough that you can destroy it with a fireball of your own, but the Game Boy port sees it only rise to about Firebrand's feet, meaning you either need to dodge it or drop down to shoot it out of the air, making for a bit more of a challenge that I appreciated. The final change is a concession to the blurry nature of the original Game Boy screen. In the first Gargoyle's Quest, the map moved very slowly. The NES game changed this, and Firebrand moves much faster in the overworld. However, since moving at that pace would make the old dot matrix screen of the Game Boy look like a giant smear, they slowed the red blaze down once again. And playing the games back to back really makes you wish you could speed up again, particularly on a modern display. So that's about it. The Game Boy port really is just a smaller version of the NES game. But let's go ahead and do like we always do and take a look and a listen side by side. The original Gargoyle's Quest set a pretty high standard for Game Boy visuals, and Gargoyle's Quest 2 does the same on the NES, but I'm afraid the sequel doesn't move the needle in this department as much as its predecessor did on the Gray Brick. Musically though, I think the tracks are great, and while I tend to prefer the sound of the NES, these stereo arrangements for the Game Boy are also fantastic. And that makes it time to give the edge. There are people who will tell you that the Game Boy version of this is a hidden gem, the definitive version of this game. And I am not one of those people. Sorry. But for me, the 2 extra powers and the 2 extra stages are not enough to overcome the limited resolution and slower map exploration. NES version all the way. Though, if you have already played this version to death and knew nothing of the Game Boy version, I definitely recommend checking it out. though there is something to be said for price. This version is going for up around $100 these days, and the Game Boy port can routinely be found for considerably less than half of that. Both are honestly pretty overpriced in today's market, so I'd encourage the use of an EverDrive or grabbing the NES game on either the Wii U or 3DS Virtual Console. I mean, if you're going to throw down that kind of cash for a cartridge, spend it on Demon's Crest for the Super NES, the third game in this trilogy. Or save your money all around and get both on the Wii U or new 3DS eShop. It's totally worth it. And that does it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a tremendously happy Halloween filled with spooky video games, lots of candy, and horror movie marathons. And I'll see you next time, right here on Same Name, Different Game.
見よこの勇士あいつの強さは魔界一レッドアリーマー2ファミリーコンピューターで好評発売中 Capcom 世界初の8メガヒューカードを採用かつてない映像がスーパーグラフィックスに展開する NEC アベニュー SG 用ソフト第1弾大魔界村